Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 34th video discussing 1950s British science fiction. In this installment, I continue my look at the explosion of hardcover science fiction in the UK, the story of boom and bust. World's Work, part of the Heinemann Group, had re-entered the fray in May 1953 by resuming their now numbered Master Science Fiction series featuring 4 of John Russell Fearn's Golden Amazon novels. Chronologically 3rd to 6th in the Amazon series, it started in 1944. Fearn had sold them the novels between 1946 and 1948, when they'd first been published in the Toronto Star Weekly, but due to paper rationing, they had sat on them whilst continuing to publish their already established line of master thriller westerns that included Fearn's more recent Merridew series. We see here an example of Merridew Follows the Trail. All 5 Merridew westerns are currently available on Amazon. This title from Loom Books and the other 4 from Wildside Press. Now, Fearn's science fiction titles, The Golden Amazon's Triumph, number 1, 1953. The Amazon's Diamond Quest, number 3, 1953. The Amazon Strikes Again, number 4, 1954. And Twin of the Amazon, number 5, 1954, were interspersed with 3 American reprints. David Starr, Space Ranger, number 2, 1954. Lucky Star and Pirates of the Asteroids, number 7, 1954, were both by Paul French. That was Isaac Asimov adopting this pseudonym for his juvenile novels, and C.T. Shock by Will Stewart, who was a pseudonym of Jack Williamson. The series ended with Asimov's novel, not because of poor sales, but because World's Work had decided to phase out all the fiction titles and going forward to concentrate entirely on non-fiction. A great pity. All of Fearn's Golden Amazon novels published by World's Work are currently available from Loom Books, and the remaining 21 from the Wildside Press in the United States. Now, Robert Hale had occasionally published science fiction without identifying as such, as with Lewis Souden's Tomorrow's Comet in May 1951, the science fiction novel about the threatened destruction of the Earth by a comet. But this had been carefully disguised and labelled as a tale of our times. Bernard Newman's The Wishful Think, 1954, was about telepathic espionage, but it was published as a thriller. But later, in 1954, they suddenly threw caution to the winds with Spaceship Dust Jackets and the bold label, A Modern Science Fiction Selection. And their selections were first class. West of the Sun by Edgar Pangborn, August 1954. Planet of the Dreamers, January 1955 by John D. MacDonald. And Mission of Gravity by Hal Clement in June 1955. Another surprise entrant was Castle and Company Limited. Like most established publishers, they'd been issuing the odd fantasy title since the 1940s, including Gerald Hurd's The Great Fog and Other Weird Tales, 1947, which we saw in an earlier video, and the Doppelgangers, 1948, The Lost Cavern and Other Tales of the Fantastic, 1949, and other titles that had at least been identified as fantastic fiction or weird fiction. But Michael Harrison's allegorical science fiction novel The Brain, 1953, was presented as mainstream fiction. However, Castle finally entered the science fiction label arena with 4 top-class American anthologies. Great Stories of Science Fiction, edited by Murray Leinster, 1953. Looking Forward, edited by Milton Lesser, 1954. Startling Stories, edited by Samuel Mines, 1955, and Portals of Tomorrow, edited by August Derleth, also 1955. The reason for so many excellent American choices lay not with the astuteness of the publishers, but with knowledgeable literary agents such as Lawrence Pollinger, who played a leading role in promoting good science fiction, helping to stem the tide of so much rubbish. His firm of Pern, Pollinger and Hyam was probably behind most of the better choices. Further support for this supposition has been provided by the researchers of latter-day anthologist and horror fantasy expert Stephen Jones. Having gained access to the editorial archives of publisher Gollancz, Jones has revealed that Pollinger had been linking up with Oscar J. Friend of the Otis Klein Agency in America since 1949, when they'd been trying to place the collection Best Supernatural Stories of H.P. Lovecraft. In the event, as Jones revealed, they were initially unsuccessful, but Lovecraft later became established in Britain with hardcover publisher Gollancz. Victor Gollancz himself had discovered Lovecraft's work whilst on a trip to America in 1950. He'd met August Derleth, Lovecraft's current US publisher and rights controller, with his Arkham House imprint. Gollancz went on to publish British hardcover editions of all Lovecraft's fantasy and science fiction books, beginning in 1951. Here we see their edition of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and also advertising the earlier Lovecraft edition of The Haunter of the Dark. Museum Press had earlier printed an edition of The Lurker at the Threshold by Lovecraft and Derleth in 1948, followed by a reprint of another Arkham House collection, The Hounds of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long. Both books were ostensibly presented as supernatural and weird horror stories, which they undoubtedly were, rather than as science fiction. But despite being attractive editions, they didn't sell well at all. The museum chose not to follow them up at the time. Then, in August 1951, the museum published American Edmund Hampton's The Star Kings, billed as science fiction at its best. This was a label that would persist for years on diverse British editions, constantly repeated, there it is again, presumably in an attempt to differentiate it from other publishers' inferior offerings. But it was used so often by so many publishers that it eventually became meaningless. The Star Kings looked like remaining a one-off until September the following year, when they published another Hampton title, City at World's End. This time they meant business, identifying that title as the first in their Science Fiction Club series. You see on the back cover there. John Cornell was approached by Museum Press to edit this series, which steadily developed into a substantial line of books, which led much later to some confusion amongst booksellers with the totally different Science Fiction Book Club, which commenced shortly after. The museum editions were not in any way a book club, but straightforward ordinary trade editions. The label was simply an attempt to attract reader loyalty to their line. Their house ads, offering to supply details of the new and forthcoming science fiction publications. Museum, or Cornell, eventually phased the label out in favour of Books of the Future. In his position as editor of Britain's leading science fiction magazine, New Worlds, Cornell was uniquely placed to know all the best writers on both sides of the Atlantic. Increasingly, British publishers began to ask his advice, and Cornell quickly drifted into becoming a literary agent himself, whilst continuing to edit his magazines. Under Cornell's guidance, the science fiction line quickly flowered to produce a string of first-class titles, mostly by American authors or UK writers whose books had already appeared first in the United States. The only exceptions were a few titles by Cornell himself, anthologies, and John Burke, who worked at museum as an editor and wrote as Jonathan Burke. Dust jacket art was upgraded to full colour, and apart from the occasional dud, was of a good standard by experienced science fiction artists such as John Pollock, Gerard Quinn and John Richards. Cornell's first titles in 1953 were The Blind Spot in March, a creaky but atmospheric old pulp yarn by Austin Hall and Homer Eon Flint that had been published in America initially, and it was pushed on Cornell by Forry Ackerman, who had written an introduction for it. It was followed by the much better The Puppet Masters by Robert A. Heinlein in April. The books were successful enough to be followed by Dreadful Sanctuary by Eric Frank Russell in October, with a Ray Harry Turner cover, and a genuine classic, The Humanoids by Jack Williamson in December. This book was a real collector's item. 1954 brought a further 5 titles between February and October. Cornell's all-British anthology, Gateway to Tomorrow, followed by 4 novels. Russell's Sentinels from Space, Williamson's Dragon's Island, alas this one wasn't up to Williamson's usual high standard, and The Splendid The Starmen by Lee Brackett, Mrs. Edmund Hamilton, and a fine author in her own right, and an original British novel, Pattern of Shadows by Jonathan Burke. 1955 continued the parade of strong titles, World Out of Mind by J.T. Mackintosh, Gateway to the Stars, another all-British author's Cornell anthology, Assignment in Eternity by Robert Heinlein, with a nice Richards cover, Alien Landscapes, a strong first collection by John Burke, and Born Leader, another Mackintosh novel, in September. But the end was in sight. Despite opening in February 1956 with Warren 300, one of Mackintosh's best novels, the year petered out in September with an obscure French translation, The Trembling Tower by Claude Yelnick. The dust jacket was downgraded to 2 colours on non-glossy stock, and the book, a quite interesting interdimensional thriller, was not identified as science fiction. The uncredited translator was John Burke. But so far as science fiction was concerned, the Museum Press was aptly named. The science fiction line was ended. But there were still other hardcover publishers throwing their hats into the science fiction ring, as we'll see in coming videos.